What was the significance to Daniel 6, verse 10? In the context of the Bible's Old Testament, Daniel 6, verse 10 is a significant verse because it highlights Daniel's unwavering faith and commitment to God despite facing mortal danger. Here's the verse from the King James Version, Daniel 6, verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Context and significance. Background. In Daniel 6, King Darius of the Medo-Persian Empire is tricked by jealous officials into issuing a decree that forbids anyone from praying to any god or man except the king for 30 days. The penalty for disobeying is being thrown into a den of lions. These officials targeted Daniel, a high-ranking Jewish exile known for his devotion to God, hoping to eliminate him. Daniel's response. Despite knowing about the decree and the deadly consequences, Daniel doesn't waver. He continues his regular practice of praying to God 3 times a day, openly facing Jerusalem, a symbolic act of devotion rooted in Jewish tradition. See 1 Kings 8, verses 44 to 48. This shows his courage, faith, and trust in God over human authority. Significance. Faith under pressure. Daniel 6, verse 10 is a powerful example of standing firm in one's beliefs, even when it's illegal or life-threatening. It's often cited as an inspiration for maintaining spiritual integrity. God's deliverance. The verse sets the stage for the famous miracle that follows. Daniel is thrown into the lion's den, but is miraculously protected by God in Daniel 6, verses 16 to 23. This reinforces the theme of divine faithfulness to those who trust in him. Theological impact. For Christians and Jews, this moment underscores obedience to God above earthly powers, a principle echoed elsewhere in Scripture, as in Acts 5, verse 29, we must obey God rather than men. Cultural legacy. The story with Daniel 6, verse 10 as a pivotal moment has become a symbol of resilience and divine protection, influencing art, literature, and sermons over centuries. Here is a more specific interpretation. Here is a focused theological and contextual reading, leaning toward a common Christian interpretation that emphasizes personal faith and resistance to idolatry. Interpretation of Daniel 6, verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Here are some key elements and meaning. Defiance of the decree. Daniel's immediate response to the king's decree, forbidding prayer to anyone but Darius, is not to hide or compromise, but to continue his practice openly. This is a deliberate act of civil disobedience rooted in allegiance to God. The interpretation here is that true faith doesn't bend to unjust human authority when it conflicts with divine commands. It reflects a prioritization of eternal loyalty over temporary safety. Windows toward Jerusalem. Facing Jerusalem while praying ties Daniel to his Jewish identity and the covenant promises of God. Jerusalem, the city of the temple, even though it was in ruins at this time during the Babylonian exile, symbolized God's presence and the hope of restoration. See 2 Chronicles 6, verses 36 to 39. This detail suggests Daniel's prayers were not just personal, but communal, interceding for his people. The interpretation often drawn is that faithfulness includes remembering one's roots and God's larger plan, even in exile or oppression. 3 times a day. The consistency of praying 3 times daily, morning, noon, and evening mirrors Jewish traditions of set prayer times, later formalized in Psalm 55, verse 17, or rabbinic practice. This discipline shows that Daniel's faith wasn't reactionary, but a deeply ingrained habit. Theologically, this is interpreted as a call to regular, intentional communion with God, regardless of circumstances. It's a model for spiritual steadfastness, kneeling and giving thanks. Kneeling signifies humility and submission to God, while giving thanks in the face of a death sentence reveals profound trust and gratitude. This isn't a desperate plea for rescue, though that may be implied later. It's worship. The interpretation here often emphasizes that genuine faith praises God even in crisis, trusting his sovereignty over outcomes. Read on for a broader theological interpretation. Resistance to idolatry. The decree essentially made Darius a godlike figure demanding exclusive worship. Daniel's refusal to comply is seen as a rejection of idolatry and a testimony to monotheism. In a Christian reading, this prefigures resistance to worldly powers that demand ultimate allegiance, as in Roman emperors in the New Testament era or modern equivalents like totalitarian regimes, precursor to Christ-like faith. Some Christian interpreters see Daniel's actions as a foreshadowing of Jesus' obedience unto death. Philippians 2 verse 8, Daniel willingly risks his life for God's honor, trusting in deliverance, whether in this life or beyond. His survival in the lion's den becomes a type, a symbolic preview of resurrection. Personal application. For believers, this verse is often interpreted as a challenge. Will you stand firm in faith when tested? It's a call to courage, consistency, and trust in God's protection, even when the lion's den looms, whether that's literal persecution or subtler pressures to conform. Historical nuance. In its original context, likely written or compiled during or after the Babylonian exile, Daniel 6 served as encouragement for Jews under foreign rule, as in Persian or later Hellenistic oppression. Daniel 6 verse 10 is interpreted as a subversive act of identity preservation, prayer as resistance to assimilation and despair. Specific takeaway. This interpretation frames Daniel 6 verse 10 as a defining moment where faith meets action. Daniel doesn't just believe in God privately, he stakes his life on it publicly. The verse teaches that authentic devotion persists through danger, trusting God to either deliver or sustain, and it inspires believers to prioritize divine will over human edicts. Now we will unwrap our 4 questions about Daniel 6 verse 10. What could be said good about this verse? What might be said bad or unsettling about this verse? What does this tell us about God? Who could be helped by sharing this verse? What might you say you like about Daniel 6 verse 10? We can appreciate how the verse captures a moment of quiet defiance and unshakable resolve. There's something compelling about Daniel's choice to keep praying, not out of spite or rebellion for its own sake, but because it's who he is. His faith isn't negotiable. The image of him kneeling by an open window facing Jerusalem, with the threat of the lion's den hanging over him, feels like a masterclass in courage without bravado. It's understated yet powerful. The rhythm of 3 times a day, it's a detail that grounds the story in a real human habit. It's not a one-off dramatic gesture. It's a life lived consistently, which makes his stand even more relatable and inspiring. And the fact that he gave thanks in that moment. That's a twist I admire. It's not just a plea for help, but gratitude in the face of danger, which hints at a deep trust that's hard to wrap my mind around, but easy to respect. From a storytelling angle, I enjoy how it sets up the tension perfectly. You know the trap's been sprung, but Daniel doesn't flinch. It's like the calm before the storm, and it makes the payoff of his deliverance later hit harder. Plus the idea of prayer as both a personal anchor and a quiet resistance to a puffed-up decree, that's a concept that resonates across time, whether you're into theology or just good narratives. What might be said bad or unsettling about Daniel 6 verse 10? Looking at Daniel 6 verse 10 from a more critical or unsettling perspective, there are a few angles that might stand out as bad or discomforting, depending on one's viewpoint. Here's what could be said. One unsettling aspect is the sheer recklessness, or what some might see as stubbornness, in Daniel's actions. He knows the decree's been signed, he knows the penalty is death by lions, and yet he doesn't just pray quietly or in secret. He goes upstairs, opens the windows, and makes it visible. To a pragmatic mind, that could feel unnecessarily provocative, almost like he's daring the authorities to catch him. It raises the question, is this faith, or is it flirting with martyrdom for no practical gain? Someone skeptical might argue it's less heroic and more inflexible, putting his life, and potentially others' stability, on the line over a ritual. And there's the exclusivity vibe. Daniel's praying toward Jerusalem, clinging to his God and his ways, while ignoring the king's command. To someone in Darius's court, or even a modern reader wary of religious absolutism that could come off as dismissive or divisive, why can't he adapt, even temporarily, to keep the peace? It might unsettle those who value compromise or see rigid devotion as a source of conflict rather than virtue. In a pluralistic lens, it's a bit of a my way or the highway moment. The powerlessness of it could also rub people the wrong way. He's kneeling, praying, giving thanks, great, but he's not doing anything to change his fate. For folks who lean toward action over faith, this passivity might feel frustrating or even naive. Why not strategize, negotiate, or flee instead of betting everything on divine intervention? It's unsettling if you think he's just handing his enemies the win. And honestly, the context itself is grim. This isn't a feel-good story at this point. It's a guy walking into a trap because he won't bend, and the next step is a death sentence. If you strip away the miraculous ending for a sec, it's bleak. A loyal servant of the empire, betrayed by jealous rivals, facing execution for something as private as prayer. That raw injustice might leave a bad taste, especially if you dwell on how unfair it is before the lion's den twist kicks in. What does this tell us about God in Daniel 6 verse 10? Since Daniel 6 verse 10 describes Daniel's act of prayer rather than quoting his words or directly detailing God's actions, what it tells us about God is inferred through Daniel's behavior and the broader context of the chapter. The verse says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." Here's what this moment suggests about God, based on Daniel's response and the unfolding narrative. Insights about God from Daniel 6 verse 10. God is worthy of unwavering loyalty. Daniel's refusal to stop praying, even under a death threat, implies that he sees God as supremely worthy above kings, decrees, or personal safety. This tells us God is not a casual figure to Daniel, but a sovereign authority who commands ultimate allegiance. His willingness to risk everything suggests God's greatness and reliability in Daniel's eyes. God is a source of strength. Daniel's calm consistency, praying just as he had done before, hints that God provides stability in chaos. For Daniel to kneel and pray rather than panic or flee, God must be a dependable anchor, offering strength that outweighs the fear of lion. This portrays God as a steady presence, even when human powers turn hostile. God inspires gratitude, not just pleas. The detail that Daniel gave thanks in this dire moment tells us God is more than a problem solver to him. Daniel's thanksgiving suggests God's character, his goodness, faithfulness, or past provision merits praise regardless of the outcome. Paints God as benevolent and trustworthy, not a transactional deity who only gets attention in emergencies. God is tied to covenant and hope. Facing Jerusalem while praying connects God to his promises for Israel, as in restoration from exile, as in 2 Chronicles 6 verses 38 to 39. This tells us God is faithful to his covenant, a keeper of long-term commitments, not just a God of the moment. Daniel's orientation toward Jerusalem implies he believes God's plans endure, even in a foreign empire. God is accessible. Daniel's thrice daily prayer habit, unchanged by the decree, suggests God is approachable and present, not distant or capricious. This regular intimate interaction tells us God welcomes devotion and isn't swayed by human edicts. It's as if Daniel knows God's ear is always open, decree or no decree. A broader context reinforces this: God's power over earthly authority. The decree comes from Darius, a king manipulated into a divine role, yet Daniel prays to God instead. Later, when God shuts the lions' mouths, as in 6:22, it's clear he trumps human power. In 6:10, this is foreshadowed. Daniel acts like God's authority is already supreme, God's protection. While not explicit in 6:10, the outcome, survival in the den, reflects back on this verse, suggesting God honors those who honor him. Daniel's confidence here hints at a God who delivers, though that's more implied than stated outright. What it says about God. From Daniel 6 verse 10, God emerges as a figure of immense worth, constancy, and power, someone who inspires a faith so deep that a death sentence doesn't disrupt it. He's not just a cosmic enforcer, but a personal, covenant-keeping God who sustains Daniel's gratitude and hope in the darkest hour. It's less about what God does in this verse and more about who he is to make Daniel act this way: sovereign, faithful, and deserving of trust. Who could be helped by sharing Daniel 6 verse 10? Sharing Daniel 6 verse 10 with its portrayal of steadfast faith, courage, and gratitude under pressure, could resonate with and help a variety of people facing different struggles or seeking inspiration. Here's who might benefit, along with why. 1. People facing persecution or opposition. Who individuals enduring religious, political, or social persecution, think dissidents in oppressive regimes, believers in areas hostile to their faith, or anyone penalized for their convictions. Why Daniel's choice to pray despite a death decree offers a model of standing firm. It could encourage them to hold fast to their beliefs, even when the cost is high, and trust that their integrity matters whether deliverance comes or not. 2. Those struggling with fear or anxiety. Who people overwhelmed by looming threats like job loss, health crises, or personal conflicts, where the future feels like a lion's den. Why Daniel's calm consistency and thanksgiving in crisis could inspire them to find peace through routine faith or gratitude, shifting focus from fear to a bigger perspective. It's a reminder that you can face the worst and still kneel in trust. 3. Believers seeking deeper faith. Who Christians, Jews, or other spiritual folks wanting to grow in discipline or devotion, maybe someone who's hit a spiritual rut or feels their faith wavers under pressure. Why the 3 times a day habit and Daniel's unwavering commitment could motivate them to build stronger, more intentional practices. It's a nudge that faith isn't just for Sundays, it's a lifestyle that holds up when tested. 4. Advocates for justice or nonconformity. Activists, whistleblowers, or anyone resisting unjust systems, people who defy corrupt rules or cultural norms at personal risk. Why Daniel's quiet defiance of an idolatrous decree could bolster their resolve. It shows resistance doesn't have to be loud, just firm, and that aligning with a higher principle can outlast temporary powers. 5. Leaders under scrutiny. Who public figures, managers, or community leaders facing envy, betrayal, or unfair criticism, like Daniel did from his rivals. Why his example of staying true to himself despite a setup could help them navigate traps with dignity. It's a lesson in integrity over popularity, especially when the stakes escalate. 6. People doubting God's presence. Who those questioning if God or a higher power cares or shows up, maybe after setbacks or silence. Why Daniel's confidence in praying to a God he trusts, even without immediate proof of rescue, might nudge them to reconsider. Paired with the later deliverance, it hints that God's involvement isn't always obvious in the moment but can still be real. 7. Students of history or ethics. Who scholars, teachers, or anyone wrestling with questions of loyalty, authority, and moral courage could be in a classroom or personal study. Why the verse offers a case study in balancing obedience to God or conscience against human law. It's a timeless dilemma when to comply, when to resist, and Daniel's choice sparks discussion or reflection. How it helps. Sharing Daniel 6 verse 10, whether as a story, a verse, or a principle, could offer hope, a practical example, or a challenge. It's not about promising a happy ending, though Daniel gets one. It's about showing what's possible when you lean into something bigger than the threat in front of you. For some, it's spiritual fuel. For others, it's a human story of grit.